It was late, cold rain poured from the sky. She saw him, an old man alone at the bus stop. No coat, no way home. She didn't ask his name, just brought him in, gave him soup, a warm place to rest. By morning he was gone, leaving only a note, "Thank you." A year passed. She lost her job. Her son was turned away from school. Everything began to fall apart. Then a letter came, a meeting was arranged, and when she walked into that room, she never imagined who would be standing there or what he was about to say. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. It was nearing the end of a long shift when Emily Mitchell finished cleaning the community center. The night had been slow. Only a handful of people had come in to use the gym, and the usual hustle and bustle of the center had given way to an eerie stillness. As she packed her cleaning supplies into the cart, Emily couldn't shake the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. She had been working 2 jobs for months now, the long hours and constant strain wearing on her both physically and emotionally. She had just a few minutes before the last bus of the night would take her to her small apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet part of the city, away from the more expensive areas where rent was cheaper and the noise of city life didn't feel so overwhelming. Her apartment wasn't much, but it was hers, and that meant something, especially now. As she walked toward the bus stop, the evening air was sharp with the cold of approaching winter. She wrapped her coat tightly around her. Wishing she had remembered gloves, the streets were empty, the usual hum of life replaced by the occasional distant car or the faint rustle of leaves. It was the kind of night where even the world seemed tired, weighed down by the silence. At the bus stop, she noticed the figure of a man sitting on the bench, hunched over and staring down at the pavement. He wasn't a young man, at least in his late 70s, with deep lines etched into his face and eyes that seemed far older than his years. His clothes were ragged, a heavy coat that had seen better days and a pair of worn-out boots that were far from weatherproof. He sat there unmoving, like someone who had forgotten the world around them. Emily paused as she approached him. There was something about the way he sat there, so still, that made her feel uneasy. Maybe it was the way his shoulders seemed to sink with the weight of a lifetime of sorrow. Or maybe it was the way his eyes flickered up at her, almost as if he had been waiting for her to notice him. She took a deep breath and approached cautiously, her shoes tapping softly on the sidewalk. "Excuse me, sir?" she said, her voice warm but tentative. "Are you okay?" The man looked up slowly, as though startled out of a deep trance. His eyes were tired, weary, in a way that made Emily feel a twinge of sympathy. He blinked a few times before responding in a voice that was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I'm just waiting for the bus," he said, his words slow, measured. His lips barely moved, as if speaking required too much effort. "Just waiting. That's all." Emily looked around. The bus stop was isolated with no one else in sight. The bus wouldn't be there for another 20 minutes, and the man looked like he might collapse at any moment. She hesitated, unsure whether it was her place to help a complete stranger. "Are you sure you're all right? You don't look so good," Emily said, taking a step closer. The man shook his head slowly, as if the effort of explaining was too much. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his voice betrayed him. There was a tremor in his hands as he clutched his coat tightly. "Waiting for the bus." That's all. Emily studied him for a moment longer, then glanced at her watch. The last bus of the night wouldn't come soon enough. She could sense his exhaustion, his struggle to stay upright, and something deep inside her told her that he wasn't fine. He needed help, and she couldn't just walk away. "Where are you headed?" Emily asked, her heart swelling with compassion. The man blinked again, staring out at the street as though searching for something he couldn't find. "Nowhere," he said, finally, his voice hollow. "No place to go." There was a long silence between them. Emily didn't know what to say. The words "no place to go" hung in the air, heavy and cold. She wanted to offer him something, anything, but her mind was racing, trying to figure out what she could possibly do for him. She barely had enough to keep herself afloat, let alone someone else. But as she looked at the man, his eyes dull with a life too full of pain, she couldn't just leave him. He had no one else, and even if it was only for one night, she could offer him something better than the cold, empty bench. "How about you come with me?" she said, suddenly surprising herself with her boldness. "I don't live far from here. You can rest there for the night, and I'll make you something warm to eat. It's the least I can do." The man didn't respond at first, as if weighing her words. He looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and disbelief, as if kindness was something foreign to him. Finally, after a long moment, he nodded once, barely, but it was enough. Emily smiled gently. All right, come on then. It's not far. She extended her arm and he hesitated for just a second before standing shakily. His legs were stiff and it seemed like he had trouble moving at first. Emily watched him, her heart aching at the sight of his struggle. She had seen so many people in her life who were just giving up, letting the world wear them down until they were nothing more than shadows of who they once were. This man, Jack, was no different though. He had an air of dignity that somehow still clung to him despite it all. They walked together in silence, the cold night pressing in around them, but the warmth of her gesture seemed to break through the chill. Emily wasn't sure what she had expected from this night, but something told her that this would change her in ways she couldn't yet understand. When they arrived at her apartment, she let him inside and the warmth of the small space immediately surrounded them. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and old wood, a comfort she'd grown used to. Emily set down her bag and gestured for him to take a seat on the worn couch, which had seen better days, but still had a welcoming feel to it. "I'll make something for you," Emily said, moving toward the small kitchen. "Just make yourself comfortable." Jack nodded, sitting down slowly on the couch, his eyes following her every movement. Emily could sense his discomfort, the way he tried to keep his distance, not used to receiving kindness from anyone. It made her heart ache. While she prepared a simple meal, scrambled eggs, toast, and a cup of hot tea, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. Here she was inviting a stranger into her home with no real idea of who he was or where he'd come from. But somehow the act felt right even though she was scared. When she brought the food over to him, he looked at the plate with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, as if he hadn't expected something so simple yet kind. He didn't speak, just nodded in silent appreciation as he began to eat each bite, seeming to revive him just a little. Emily sat opposite him, watching him carefully. She wanted to know more about him to understand the layers of pain he carried with him, but she didn't press him. Sometimes silence was the most comforting thing. After dinner, she showed him to the small room that had once been her son's. It was empty now, with only a simple bed and a small dresser. "You can sleep here tonight," Emily said, gesturing to the bed. "I'll let you have it for as long as you need." Jack looked at her, his eyes softening. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emily smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her that she couldn't shake. She didn't know what the future held for either of them, but in that moment she felt a connection, an unspoken bond between them formed by simple acts of kindness. As Emily closed the door quietly behind her, she sat on the couch and allowed herself a moment of peace. The world outside might have been cold and harsh, but here in her little apartment, she had done something good. And for tonight, that was enough. The next morning, Emily awoke to the faint sound of the kettle boiling in the kitchen. She stretched, still groggy from the restless night, but there was a different feeling in the air, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that she was tired, it was more that she felt unsettled. The events of the previous night had felt so surreal as she pulled herself out of bed and put on a sweater. Her mind lingered on the old man Jack. The way he had sat there exhausted and worn down had shaken something deep within her. She couldn't shake the image of his tired, wrinkled face, the hollow look in his eyes. She had done something simple, offered him a meal and a place to stay, but it had felt like more than that. She hadn't just helped him. She had felt a quiet sense of connection with him, a shared humanity that was hard to put into words. It was strange how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, affecting two people in ways neither could fully understand. She walked into the kitchen where Jack was sitting at the small dining table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea. He looked more composed than the night before, though there was still a weight in his eye. Emily smiled at him as she walked in. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still hushed from sleep. Jack looked up, his lips curving slightly in acknowledgement. "Morning," he replied, his voice rough but with an edge of warmth. He took a sip from his cup, his gaze never quite meeting hers, but his posture was less hunched than it had been the night before. It was a small improvement, but it didn't go unnoticed. "Are you feeling better?" Emily asked, sitting across from him. She hadn't expected much, but she felt an odd urge to check on him. His presence in her small home seemed like such a stark contrast to the usual quiet mornings, and she wasn't sure why, but she found herself wanting to make sure he was okay. Jack nodded, albeit slowly. "I'm getting there. Thanks for letting me stay." Emily's heart warmed at his words. It wasn't much, but there was a sense of gratitude in them, something she hadn't seen from him the night before. It was a small step, but she could tell it meant something to him. "Of course," she said, trying to ease the tension in the room. You don't have to thank me, it's just a place to sleep. There was a long pause, the sound of the kettle boiling in the background, filling the silence. Jack put his cup down on the table and leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the window as though lost in thought. Emily watched him, not wanting to pry, but unable to shake the feeling that there was more to his story. He wasn't a man who looked like he had just wandered into her life by accident. His presence felt deliberate, as though he had been waiting for something waiting for her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jack spoke again. I didn't tell you much about myself last night. I'm not sure why I'm even here, but I guess I owe you an explanation. Emily leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. You don't have to explain anything if you're not ready. But I'm glad you're talking. Jack took a deep breath, his fingers tapping the edge of the table nervously. I was in the Army for a long time, 27 years. Saw a lot of things, did a lot of things I'm not proud of. I retired as a colonel, but after everything, I just couldn't find my place anymore. I came home, tried to settle down, but it wasn't the same. Things change. People change. He paused, staring at the window again, as though the words had taken something out of him. Emily listened quietly, feeling a knot form in her stomach as she imagined the things he must have seen during his years of service. There's a lot of things I wish I could forget, Jack continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't. The memories haunt me, and I didn't know where to go after I left. So I just kept moving until I ended up here. Emily didn't know what to say. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on the room, and for a moment the silence between them felt impossibly heavy. But she knew one thing for sure: Jack needed to be heard, and she was willing to listen. After all, hadn't she invited him in for a reason? It wasn't just for the meal or the bed. It was because something about him called to her, something she couldn't quite explain. I'm glad you told me, Emily said after a moment. I'm sure it wasn't easy. Jack gave her a small nod but didn't look at her directly. It's never easy, but it's better than holding it all in. They sat there for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Emily sipped her coffee, letting the warmth of the drink comfort her as she tried to figure out what to do next. She had offered him a bed for the night, but that gesture seemed so small now in the face of all that Jack had endured. Eventually, Jack broke the silence again. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I have no place left to go. Emily's heart clenched. She hadn't been expecting him to stay long. She hadn't expected him to open up to her so much. But the idea of him wandering again out there in the cold with no one to rely on it unsettled her. She couldn't let him go back to that. You don't have to leave yet, Emily said softly. If you're willing, I'll help. You can stay here, even if it's just for a while. We can figure things out together. Jack's eyes flickered with something, surprise, relief, maybe even hope. He didn't speak immediately, but the way his body relaxed just slightly told Emily that her words had struck a chord. I'm not sure what help I can accept, he replied, his voice cautious, still carrying the weight of his past. But I'm not in a position to refuse kindness either. Emily smiled gently, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Maybe it was small, but it was something they could take it one day at a time. That was all she could promise. As the day passed, Emily made a plan. She wasn't sure how Jack would fit into her life, how his presence would affect everything she was struggling with. But she did know one thing for certain: she wouldn't let him leave without offering some kind of hope, some kind of opportunity. And so, as the afternoon faded into evening, she found herself thinking of possibilities. Maybe she could help him find work. Maybe she could get him back into touch with a VA office, see if there was any kind of assistance he could access. The options were few, but at least there was something. They could start there. Just as the thought crossed her mind, Emily's phone rang, breaking her concentration. It was her boss, and the weight of the conversation that followed made her stomach tighten. Emily, her boss's voice was sharp. I need to speak with you. There's been a development. Can you come in? We need to discuss your future with the company. Emily's heart sank. She hadn't expected this. The last time they spoke, she had been assured that her job was secure, that her hard work would pay off. But now, the fear that had been building in the pit of her stomach for months threatened to spill over. Sure, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but it was no use. I'll be there soon. She hung up, her mind racing. She didn't know what was coming, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her world was about to change in ways she wasn't ready for. And as she turned toward Jack, who had been silently watching her from across the room, she realized her life was already changing in ways she never expected. The following days passed in a blur. Emily's world had always felt like it was on the edge of tipping into chaos. But now, with Jack in her life, there was a sense of quiet that had been absent for years. Though his presence in her small apartment was unexpected, it brought an unexpected comfort. Jack wasn't just a guest. He had become a quiet companion, a reminder that kindness, even in its smallest form, could reshape the course of one's life. But the phone call with her boss still lingered in her mind, an insistent echo of the uncertainty she had been living with for months. Emily had always done her best to keep her fears hidden, to push through despite the mounting pressures of her job and the struggles at home. But now, with Jack under her roof, she found it harder to compartmentalize her anxieties. She didn't want to add another burden to the already heavy load she was carrying. The day after the call, she found herself walking into her boss's office, her stomach tight with apprehension. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her bag, a feeling of dread building with each step. As she entered her boss, a middle-aged woman named Karen didn't even glance up from the paper she was reviewing. "Sit down, Emily," Karen said, her tone sharp. "We need to talk about your performance." Emily sat down, her heart thudding in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had arrived, she wasn't prepared. She braced herself for the criticism she knew was coming. She had been late more often than usual in the past few months, and her usual efficiency had slipped. But how could she explain the toll her personal life had taken on her? How could she tell Karen that her days were consumed with worry about her son's future, her dwindling finances, and the weight of a life she was struggling to keep afloat? Karen finally looked up, her eyes narrow. "I don't know how to say this, so I'll be blunt," she began. "You've been a valuable employee, Emily, but lately things have slipped. Your performance isn't where it needs to be, and frankly, I'm not sure if this job is the right fit for you anymore." Emily's stomach dropped. She fought the urge to let the tears come. She had worked so hard to get here. This job had been her lifeline for so long. To lose it now when everything else seemed to be falling apart, she couldn't bear the thought. "I understand." Emily managed her voice barely above a whisper. She felt the weight of her resignation settle over her, the cold certainty that she was on the verge of losing everything. I've been doing my best." Karen nodded, but her gaze softened. "I know you have, Emily, but sometimes doing your best isn't enough. We all have to make tough decisions. I've decided that I have no choice but to let you go." The finality of the words hit like a physical blow. Emily's mind spun the world around her, starting to tilt. She hadn't prepared for this. She had braced herself for criticism, but not for this. She had hoped against hope that her efforts would be enough. But in the end, it wasn't. "I understand," Emily said, her voice cracking. "Thank you for the opportunity." As she left the office, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. How would she explain this to Jack? How could she tell her son Lucas, who had been looking forward to a better future because of the scholarship? The weight of her failure settled heavily in her chest, and she felt a deep sinking sense of defeat. The following days were a blur of phone calls and emails, all leading to one inevitable conclusion. Emily was out of a job, the bills piled up, and the stress of finding a new job while trying to keep everything together was overwhelming. She found herself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she would keep moving forward. Meanwhile, Jack had been quieter than usual. He spent most of his time in his small room reading books and occasionally talking to Emily, but there was something different in his demeanor. Emily couldn't place it. There was a weight to his presence, as if he too was carrying something too heavy to speak of. She wondered if his past was catching up with him in the same way her present was crashing down around her. One evening, as Emily sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills in front of her, Jack appeared in the doorway. He was standing there, his figure framed by the dim light of the hallway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a silent understanding between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. Finally, Jack stepped into the room, his face grim but determined. "Emily, I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but heavy with something that made her look up at him. She met his gaze, unsure of what he was about to say. "What's on your mind?" "I've been meaning to tell you something," Jack said. He walked over to the table and sat down across from her. "I don't know how much I've been able to help you, but I want to make it right." Emily frowned slightly, her heart racing. "Make it right, Jack. You've already done more than enough by staying here. I don't want you to feel like you have to." Jack raised his hand, cutting her off gently. "No, listen, I want to help you. You've helped me when I needed it the most, and I don't take that lightly. I'm not sure what I can offer, but there's something I can do. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I think I can make it work." Emily looked at him in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Jack's eyes softened, his voice almost tender as he spoke. "I told you I used to be in the Army. But what I didn't tell you is that I've made a few contacts since I left, people who could help you. I know I can't fix everything, but if you're willing to accept it, I can reach out to some of those contacts. They can help you get back on your feet." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emily didn't know what to say. Her pride, her need to stand on her own, fought against the overwhelming sense of gratitude she felt. She had always prided herself on doing things alone, on not needing anyone's help. But the weight of her situation was too great, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of letting someone in. Jack Baum. Emily started unsure how to find the right words. Her voice was soft, vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. "I don't know what to say. I don't want to impose on you more than I already have." Jack's expression softened, his eyes full of understanding. "You're not imposing, Emily. You've been more than kind to me. I don't see it as a burden. I see it as a way to make up for all the things I've done wrong." The sincerity in his voice hit Emily like a wave, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the knot in her chest loosen. Maybe this was the beginning of something unexpected, but something that could change the course of their lives. "I'll accept your help," Emily finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But on one condition." Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "That we do it together. I can't just sit here and wait for things to happen. If I'm going to accept your help, I want to be a part of the solution. I want to work for it, Jack." Jack smiled, a warmth in his eyes. "Deal," and in that moment, everything seemed possible again. The days that followed Jack's offer were a strange blend of uncertainty and hope. Emily had never been one to accept help easily. It wasn't pride exactly. It was more a deep-seated belief that she had to prove herself. She had spent years, decades, even building a life from nothing, to let someone else take the lead, to let them bear the burden of her problems. Felt like a surrender she wasn't sure she was ready for. But something in Jack's offer and the quiet sincerity of his words had cracked open something in her. Maybe it was the fact that he too understood what it was like to struggle to fight against an invisible tide that seemed determined to pull you under. And so Emily found herself sitting in Jack's small room. Late one night, her hands clenched around a steaming mug of tea. Jack had left the room to make a few calls, reaching out to the contacts he had promised. Emily sat there in the silence, her thoughts swirling. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, the fog of despair seemed to lift just a little. The next morning, Jack was already up and pacing the small living room when Emily emerged from her bedroom. He was talking to someone on the phone, his voice low but firm, and she couldn't help but overhear a few key phrases. "Yes, I know it's a long shot, but you know her situation. I'm asking for a chance, not a handout." Emily froze in the doorway, a pang of guilt twisting in her stomach. She hated the idea of anyone doing favors for her, especially on the basis of her connection to Jack. But as she watched him standing there with that same quiet intensity that had first drawn her to him, she realized that he wasn't doing this out of pity. He was doing it because he believed in her, because he cared. And maybe that was what she needed, to let someone care, even just for a moment. Jack hung up the phone and turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but with a glint of something she couldn't quite place in his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice steady but holding an edge of excitement. "I've made a few calls. I got you an interview at a temp agency this afternoon. They're short on people, and if you do well, they might have something permanent for you." Emily blinked, stunned. "You did that for me?" she asked, her voice small, almost incredulous. Jack nodded, his face softening. "It's a start, but you're the one who has to do the work. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It won't be easy, but I believe you can handle it." Her heart swelled with something she couldn't quite define. Gratitude, yes, but also a deep sense of unease. This wasn't just about getting a job. It was about proving to herself that she could rise above the rubble of her life and build something again. It was about finding her own way forward, one step at a time. The interview at the temp agency wasn't as daunting as Emily had expected. She had spent the night preparing, reviewing her resume, and thinking about the questions she might face. By the time she arrived at the agency's office, she felt a quiet confidence, the remnants of the same determination that had carried her through the hardest times in her life. She could do this. She had to. The office was small, cramped, even, but it smelled faintly of fresh coffee, and the receptionist greeted her with a smile that made the entire place feel warmer. As she sat in the waiting area, her hands resting on her lap, she reminded herself of what Jack had said. "You're the one who has to do the work." She wasn't going to let him down. Not this time. When it was her turn, a man in his early 40s wearing a crisp suit and glasses led her to a small conference room. His name was Tom, and he introduced himself with a firm handshake before gesturing for her to sit. The questions began immediately as standard interview fare, but Emily answered each one with the same calm professionalism she had honed over the years. As they talked, something shifted. The tension she had carried for so long began to melt away. She realized that this interview wasn't just an opportunity to get back on her feet, it was a chance to reclaim her dignity, her confidence. She had spent too long feeling like a failure, like the weight of her life circumstances had determined her worth. But here in this small room with Tom, she felt something stirring in her, a quiet fire that refused to be snuffed out. By the time the interview was over, Tom was nodding appreciatively. "You've got the experience we're looking for, Emily. I think you'll fit in well with our clients. We'll get you started on a few assignments, and if things go well, there might be something more permanent down the line." She stood up, extending her hand, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I appreciate this opportunity." As she left the office, the weight in her chest had lessened just a little. She wasn't out of the woods yet. There was still so much to do, so many uncertainties ahead. But for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. The following days were a blur of busy work and late nights. Emily threw herself into every assignment she was given, determined to prove herself worthy of the opportunity Jack had helped her secure. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was doing something that mattered. Jack was there too, in his quiet way, offering encouragement without making a big deal of it. He would often check in on her, asking how the job was going, how she was holding up. And each time Emily found herself grateful for his presence, for the stability he offered when her world felt like it was spinning out of control. It was during one of these late-night conversations that Jack revealed something that made Emily pause. "You know," Jack said one evening as they sat in the kitchen, the dim light of the overhead lamp casting soft shadows across his face, "I've been thinking about my own past, about everything that's brought me to this point." Emily looked up from her plate, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Jack's eyes seemed distant for a moment, as though he were pulling himself back from a far-off memory. "I told you I was in the army, right? Well, after I left, I didn't just go straight to civilian life. I got involved in some things, people, and I learned a lot about the world, about power, about connections, things that, well, things that you don't just walk away from." Emily set her fork down, her interest growing. "What kind of things?" Jack hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "Let's just say that some of those connections could come in handy for both of us if it comes down to it. I might be able to help you with more than just finding a job." His words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. It wasn't clear what he meant, but Emily could feel the weight of his offer, the depth of his experience. She realized that Jack wasn't just helping her out of kindness. He was using everything he knew, every resource at his disposal to make sure she had a chance. She nodded slowly. "I don't know what you mean by all that, Jack, but I trust you. Just promise me we'll do this right." "No shortcuts." Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll do it right, Emily. I promise." 1 year, that was how much time had passed since the night Emily brought a shivering, exhausted veteran into her modest apartment, giving him warmth, food, and the simple dignity of being seen. Jack hadn't forgotten. Not for a second. The seasons had shifted. The harshness of winter had given way to the gentle bloom of spring, then the heat of summer, and eventually the amber leaves of fall. Now another winter was arriving this time, bringing with it something different, something new. Emily had changed. She still carried herself with the quiet humility of someone used to doing more with less. But there was a new spark in her eyes, a subtle confidence that hadn't been there before. She'd earned it through hard work, long nights, and the courage to start again. The temp job had turned into a full-time position, not glamorous but steady. Enough to pay rent, buy groceries without panic, and give her son Noah a shot at something better. Noah had changed too. He'd gone from being a quiet, unsure teenager to someone more grounded. He still struggled, sometimes the way any kid does, growing up without a father figure. But now he had something, someone to look up to. Jack had stepped into his life in a way no one expected. Not as a replacement, but as a presence. Calm, reliable, Emily hadn't asked for it. Jack just showed up one afternoon with an old fishing rod and 2 sandwiches. Noah had barely spoken at first, but something about Jack's steady silence, the kind that didn't need to fill every space with noise, drew the boy in. By the 3rd weekend, they were laughing. Jack didn't try to teach Noah anything at first. He just sat with him, listened, and let him be who he was. It made a difference. Emily saw it in the way Noah held himself, in the way he looked Jack in the eye. in the way he started believing in his own worth again. Then came the day Emily received a letter, a rejection. Noah had applied to a private school scholarship program. They offered full rides to underprivileged kids who showed potential. He had potential in spades, and Jack had encouraged him to apply, even helping him write his essay. But now the envelope sat heavy in Emily's hands. One sentence, "We regret to inform you." Emily felt her chest tighten. She tried to smile in front of Noah, tried to pretend it wasn't a big deal. But the truth was, she had pinned so many hopes on that opportunity. She knew the local public school wasn't giving him what he needed, and this was supposed to be the break. That night, she stood by the window long after Noah had gone to bed. Snow was starting to fall, the soft, silent kind that blanketed everything in white, giving even the roughest streets a temporary beauty. But all Emily could feel was the weight of helplessness creeping back in. "He deserves more than I can give him," she whispered. "Then let me help," she turned. Jack stood in the doorway, a quiet strength in his posture. "I can talk to someone," he said. "Just give me a day." Emily shook her head. "Jack, I can't let you pull strings. That's not how I want this to happen. I don't want a favor. I want him to earn it. He did earn it," Jack replied gently. "You both did." 2 days later, Emily received another letter. It wasn't from the scholarship committee, it was from the school itself, a handwritten note enclosed in a formal envelope. "Dear Ms. Carter, we are pleased to inform you that due to recent changes in our sponsorship program, your son, Noah Carter, has been awarded a full tuition scholarship effective immediately. The donor has requested to remain anonymous, but asked us to share the following message. This is not charity. This is an investment in a boy who reminded me what resilience looks like. Welcome to the family." Emily stood frozen. Her eyes blurred as tears welled up, falling before she could stop them. She read the note again. And again, Jack didn't say a word when she showed it to him. He just placed a hand gently on her shoulder, that was all. But it was enough. She knew he had done that. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Emily still worked long hours, bills still came, but now there was breathing room. Noah flourished in his new school. Jack quietly helped with tutoring when things got tough. Emily began taking evening classes, just a few at first, toward a certificate in office administration. She never thought she'd go back to school at her age, but Jack kept saying, "It's never too late to rewrite your story." Jack had his own story too. One evening after Noah had gone to bed, he told her about the rank he never spoke of, a colonel, about the unit he had commanded, about the men he'd lost. He had retired with honors, but had walked away from a system that at times felt like it forgot the people who gave everything. That's when he started giving anonymously. Scholarships, grants, housing assistance, quiet contributions. "Never in his name. I didn't want it to be seen as a hero," he said softly. "I just didn't want to forget what it means to be human." Emily looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You never stopped being one." A year and a half after that snowy night at the bus stop, Emily stood in front of a crowd. It was a modest gathering. Parents, teachers, community members. The school had asked her to speak at a donor appreciation event. She almost said no. Public speaking wasn't her thing, but Jack had nudged her. "Tell your story," he said. "Someone out there might need to hear it." And so she did. She talked about second chances, about kind strangers, about the power of being seen. She never mentioned Jack by name, but he stood in the back of the auditorium, arms folded, eyes steady, watching afterward, as people clapped, as Noah beamed with pride. Emily walked toward him. She reached for his hand. He didn't let go. That winter, Jack moved in. It wasn't dramatic. No grand speeches. Just one night over dinner, he said, "This place feels like home." And Emily smiled, because it did. They didn't rush things. Love for them wasn't a whirlwind. It was steady, earned like bricks laid one by one. A foundation built on respect, quiet resilience, and shared wounds that slowly began to heal. Sometimes late at night, they sat on the front steps with mugs of coffee, watching the stars. They didn't need to talk. Silence with the right person could be a kind of peace. Emily never forgot what had started it all. A simple act. A cold night. A worn-out veteran. Sometimes the smallest gestures echo the loudest across time. And sometimes a simple woman with nothing to give but kindness ends up changing the course of someone else's life. And in return, hers is changed forever. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.